Up next, we have a really exciting keynote by Justin Moses, the CTO of Synthetix. He's going to be presenting on the various testing methodologies for fast iteration on Ethereum.
Cool. Okay, awesome. Welcome, everyone. It's good to be here, this virtual smart contract summit. It's definitely the first time I've presented at a virtual event, so it'll be an interesting experience. I've actually decided to take a slightly different route because we are virtual. So let me jump in here and share my screen. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we've sort of came to be and where our testing is in Synthetix. And I'm sort of playing on this little meme that's popped up. And we have quite an active community, and Synthetix has become one of our memes about the speed of iteration with which we get things going, and this idea that everything's coming soon. Perhaps that's been picked up by Kane, the founder. But I'm going to give you sort of the other side of it from the sort of the technical perspective. So a bit of a preamble about our protocol before I get started. So we're very regularly updating protocol, and I'm going to go into a lot of our different releases over the last basically 2 years. But just so you know, we do have some contracts that don't change. We have proxies and we have state contracts. We use the owner pattern, and so there is still this idea of quite a lot of centralized control. We have this protocol DAO as a multi-sig of the core contributors around the world. And governance right now is done through rough consensus on Discord. So when you're architecting on mainnet with Ethereum, there's a few things you have to keep in mind, and I just wanted to sort of raise these up here. The things that make, I guess, smart contract engineering a little bit trickier, perhaps, than regular engineering. And the first one is that you have to deal with legacy code. You have contracts out there, particularly, as I said before, with proxy and state contracts that are very, very difficult to migrate. Now, proxies, the point of them is really just to have a static address that you can point everyone to, such as exchanges, third parties, what have you, and then underneath you can change the guts of how the code works. So we do that with a lot of Synthetix, a lot of the protocol contracts. So if you want to change proxies, and we have recently, but if you want to have to do that, you basically need to contact everyone and say, hey, this isn't the token, this is. There's other ways of doing it. You can actually do a migration and require all the users to, basically go and, migrate themselves, right? Token by token, but we've gone for more of this automated approach where we basically create a new proxy and we reconnect state. And so we've worked around it, but the point is that we have lots of state contracts, lots of legacy contracts that we have to work around. That's one of our limitations. Next thing is, some of you who work in Ethereum smart contracts know, is that with EIP 170, there is a limit to how big a contract can be. And this is actually really quite frustrating, this limit. I understand why it exists, but it means that with a lot of our code, we have to rethink where things go. We can't put everything into one contract, even if this one contract might be the right place for it. We need to split it apart into different places, be it libraries, be it helper contracts, what have you. Which then leads me to the third kind of consideration with gas. Particularly now, it's a real problem, but even when Gwei was at 5 or 10, our contracts are quite complex. We have this idea of a shared debt pool. And so one of the consequences of that is that when you want to do anything as a synthetic staker, you want to issue, you want to burn, or you want to claim, we need to iterate through all the different synths and calculate the size of the debt pool, and it's quite an expensive computation. So constantly when we're developing, we're constantly thinking about where's the storage coming from? Do we have to call it externally? How many times are we calling it? We're always thinking about this. And this is part of our sort of the back of our minds. Right. So the goals that we have, in the engineering, team within Synthetix, is we want to get to TDD if we can, which seems like a lofty goal, but I think it's possible. Eventually want to go something even more ambitious, which is continuous deployment on Ethereum. So it takes the idea of having continuous integration, which is obviously basically running all your tests every time you change anything in your source control. But continuous deployment takes it to the next level and will actually deploy that. So a company like Netflix, for example, whenever they change, the change in code in their code base, they'll basically everything will automatically roll out to production. And they'll have a number of different systems that are watching. If there's any problems, it'll do an auto rollback, right? So we could actually, I think at some point, we'd like to get to this idea of continuous deployment on Ethereum, which is an incredibly intense goal, but I think it's to chainable. And finally, it's really just automation. Like, it's something that I'm very, very passionate about, is how can you automate? How do you automate just every single task that you possibly can do? And this becomes even more important when you have a distributed team. I'm in the US. We have an engineer in Uruguay. We have an engineer in London. We have quite a few engineers in Sydney. And you can imagine the problems you have when you don't automate, when you do things manually. Someone forgets to update something. Someone forgets to email. Someone forgets to Slack. The person who's awake is trying to do an audit of like what's actually happened. It's a real nightmare if you don't have systems in place to track these things. So automation is critical. First case, just to be able to move at any kind of speed, but second of all, to de-stress the engineers so they know that they can sort of, as long as these tried and tested processes have passed successfully, that they can rest assured that things are working as they expect. So it kind of gives you, automation, to my mind, really gives you the ability to iterate at speed, and any Web 2.0 startup would tell you that. Okay, so without further ado, I want to jump into the code, and I want to give you a bit of a history of Synthetix. So because this is a virtual conference, because I'm sitting down, it's all comfortable, I'm not at a podium, I could do this. So why don't we do it? So I'm just going to go and jump through a bunch of our code and sort of give you an idea of where we've gone in our history. So I'm going to jump back into v0.1. Right. So very old tag. This was Synthetix as of May of 2018. So before Synthetix was Synthetix, we were actually Haven. Sadly, we don't have the website anymore, or maybe not sadly. Some use a Wayback Machine, which isn't the best, but this gives you an idea of what Haven looked like. And Haven was, it was a stablecoin called NUSD that was backed by the collateral token, which was HAV, the Haven token. So it was a somewhat similar idea, and it ICO'd in March of 2018. So the code that came out after that ICO that took that Haven token and it had noments in here, we see it very simply, right? We have like this Haven token, we've got Solidity 4, right, 421, and we already see the sort of the skeleton of what Synthetix was back then. So you had Havens, and then you had these these noments, right? These were the stable coins. And initially in this version, we were basically using, we used Ether back before we even had Haven collateral. We actually had Ether collateral. It was very, very old. So what you see here is we have very basic sort of site. We have Travis set up here, all right, using, we have Python, and we have tests running in Python. We have the tests themselves here in a bunch of different Python files. You can see. And we have a deploy script as well that's run in Python, right? It's sort of manually updated and then deploys off to the testnets and mainnet. So this is what we were like back in a very early phase, and this was actually before my sort of primary involvement with the protocol. So Python, as much as I like it, it wouldn't necessarily be my first choice of language. So we went from that. We upgraded to the full Haven protocol, which was v1.0.1, and this was more the full Haven, where you actually had these. We had Haven, and then we had Nomens, and this was really what was the precursor to SUSD, right? But it was still basically the same kind of outline. Like, we still basically had Python tests and a Python deploy script, so it was fine, but not great, right? Like, it was good to get you out there, but when it came to iterating, it became really problematic. However, we sort of around, obviously the crypto winter was hitting in pretty heavily in 2018. As we got later and later into the year, this idea of synthetic assets became more and more interesting. And we sort of had this idea of like, well, what if we could denominate these synthetic things? At this point, it was just USD. What if we could denominate it in something else, like Aussie dollars, right? Or Japanese yen? Maybe there'd be more, there'd be more utilization for that. And so we rebranded back in December 2018 into Synthetix, right, which is what we currently are today. And as you can see from this very old site, really it was focused on foreign currencies. This idea of you could do the Korean won and the gold or the yen, because this was originally Synthetix was pitched originally for to solve this sort of a decentralized stablecoin. And so we sort of thought, what if there were other currencies? But as we added things like, we started adding things like Bitcoin and other things, we started seeing an uptick and realized that this was actually had legs. So so let's jump into that code. So 2.0. Cool. So you can see in December here, you can see the contracts have slightly changed. Now we have like Synthetix and Synths, right? And now we actually have the introduction of JavaScript tests. So we start to see truffle and JavaScript come in, and we've also have a deploy script now in JavaScript, right? But it's still not great. It's still this idea of like, oh, let's hard code in addresses in here, and like let's change what network we're doing. So every time a deploy would go on, we change the network, and we were deployed on primarily Covert, but we didn't have a lot of other test nets. And we noticed some projects were on Covert, some people on Rinkeby, what have you. It was very you go to a hackathon, and for developers, it was really hard to figure out what was the right network to be on. So, it was still quite a bit of a hodgepodge, but at least we had JavaScript, which is for me personally much more my bread and butter. Where I like Node.js and JavaScript are tools that I personally think are very useful, and I think the ecosystem is very rich, even more rich in some ways than Python for what we're trying to do here. So I feel like it made a lot of sense to start to move towards Node.js tooling wherever we could. Okay. So we also had Travis, which obviously continued on, and so you can see here in Travis, we'd actually moved on to running the tests, right? So we actually ran the tests, and then we basically deprecated our Python test. So we're just using JavaScript at this point. And then a number of months later, we took on what was pretty much the biggest problem at the time, which was these deploys. So as I showed you before, the deploy script was this hard-coded mumbo jumbo of all these different addresses, and things were being changed and committed and lost, and you had to go through commit history to figure out what addresses were where. So we introduced this publish script. And what the publish script did, it's basically the deploy script, but we created these JSON files of the information that anyone might need to use our contracts. So we took the idea of like, well, what are the addresses of everything, right? And what are the ABIs? So if I go down here, you see there's my ABI as well. So the idea here is that anyone now can hook into this, right? So we can start to use this using NPM. We can wrap this all up into a module, push it into NPM, and then anyone can from NPM get our addresses and our ABIs, right? And this was actually good for us because we had a lot of downstream with lots of dApps, and things are always constantly saying, what's the latest address? Like, what's the latest ABI? And so putting into JSON and then using NPM is kind of like this distribution model, right? And so at that same time, we obviously published this thing onto NPM, right? You'll see many different versions. I think our earliest was around that time, 218 versions. Yeah, so 2.15 was the earliest version of Synthetix that we published about that at that time, right? So the idea is you could at any point get the addresses and you can get the ABIs. So that's in April of last year. And so this was interesting, but then it was like, okay, well, what can we do? What can we do with this idea of this NPM module? Well, we sort of came up with this idea of like, well, what if we created a release pipeline? What if we took what we have and we create this thing we create this thing over, and what if we created a release pipeline? So what it looks like today is something like this. So basically what we have is when a deploy has been done, someone will go off and issue or kick off the publish of SNX, which will push it to NPM, and then that will trigger all the downstream systems like JavaScript and contract linkers, all these different things, even our docs, to update their version of Synthetix, and then rebuild themselves, and off they go, right? And that means they get the latest versions of the contracts, so the latest addresses and ABI. So this really helped us to the point where every time we wanted to iterate, we're like, okay, well, all of our downstream systems are connected. So every time we push to any testnet or even mainnet, we run through this process to make sure all of our downstream systems are up to date. Okay, so around the same time, we also created this system of like SIPs. So we took the EIP, the Ethereum improvement proposals, and we forked it into the Synthetix improvement proposals. And the idea of this is any SIP is a thing where you want to change any of the contracts. So anything a little bit like the EIPs. The idea is if you want to change the kind of the core protocol, there has to be a SIP. And so both community members and the core contributors will create these SIPs, and they get voted on, as I mentioned before, so through rough consensus in Discord. ICCPs were created as a way of tracking kind of configuration parameters in the system. So like how much collateral do you need to issue, right? Or how long should you wait after a trade to check for front running using fee reclamation? So this is like all the parameters that can be tweaked. So they're slightly different to SIPs because SIPs, as you can imagine, require release of the protocol. SCCPs can be done through rough consensus and through the protocol DAO, the owner of the contracts. Okay, so fast forward to July of 2019. So then we get along. Let's go to July 267. Okay, and here we broke up some of our tests. We came up with this idea of this integration test. So effectively what it did was it took that big publish script, that big deploy script that was written that could handle broken deploys and all sorts of different things, and basically said, well, we need to test this, right? So it basically is like an integration test, and it said, like, fire up a local Ganache, and then, you know, do your build, do your deploy, and then basically do a PVT, you know, or a smoke test. And so basically asserted that our deploy test actually, you know, our deploy script or publish script, as we call it, you know, effectively connected all the dots together, as you imagine. So it does a clean install of everything, a clean deploy of everything on Ganache, and then off it goes. Oh, and at the same time, we brought in Circle CI. So I sort of showed it to you before. But at that same time, we brought in Circle CI. So Travis was fine, but Circle CI was a lot more interesting, as I sort of showed you before. And I'll get more into this shortly. Okay, so let's jump off to when things get more interesting. So around September of last year. So this is when we brought in this idea of, we brought in this concept of naming our releases based on the order of brightest stars. So Sirius was the first one, it was the brightest star in the night sky, apart from the sun, obviously. And so yeah, we started a naming convention, right, with Sirius, and we started attaching all of our releases to these stars. So if you look in our docs and you get our releases, I can scroll down all the way down here, you see the very early releases with stuff I talked about before. But then when we started naming them, we started jumping ahead, got to Sirius is really when the first naming convention came in. And you can see this is where we start associating them with SIPs. So we kind of now start to have a bit of a tracking mechanism for both audits. So audits can look at SIPs, we can attach them to PRs, and then we attach them to this idea of this release, right, that we run typically every month or so, right? And at the same time with Sirius, we brought in this idea of like this, you know, testnet, this idea of like, what if we wanted to test the testnet? So what if we wanted to say, hey, is everything being stitched together correctly on Covert, or everything's been stitched together correctly on Rinkeby? And so we actually did is create this system where we basically send a user some test ether on this testnet. We send them some very, very small amount of like test SNX and actually get them to do, you know, simple amounts, a simple sort of issuance and burning and stuff. It's like a PVT on testnet. So this is slowly building out the different types of tests that we're having. And then fast forward to November, a couple of months later. And let's jump in. So what version? 213. So with this is with our Arcturus release, and we started basically taking our Python tests, completely moving them into legacy because they really weren't being used much anymore. And yeah, we're starting to clean up our tests. We're sort of splitting them into contracts and then publish tests and testnet tests. So we're starting to sort of slowly mature before we sort of get on to one of probably the most interesting releases for quite a while, which is the Procyon release, which is where we first moved on to Chainlink. So back in our last release of 2019, this was Procyon was quite a big deal for us. Like as you can imagine, managing our Oracle for as long as we have and dealing with the fact that the Oracle really is the biggest, central point of failure or biggest attack vector. handing over the keys, so to speak, to the kingdom to moving to a decentralized Oracle provider became a very very intimidating move, for myself in particular, because I'm spending so much time working on oracles. But at the same time, it was also pretty relieving to bring in expertise from a whole network of different people who understood about monitoring, understood about distributed systems, understood about how to manage this stuff at scale. So in the Procyon release, this was our first phase of Chainlink, but this is also when we started doing our more sophisticated docs. So the docs that you saw over here, these were actually put together by one of our engineers, who also likes Python. So this is MK docs, but actually they're quite rich, and they actually get generated every time we do a release. So when I showed you that release pipeline before, with our NPM module of Synthetix, when that changes, we can then propagate off to all different services, and one of them is docs, and we can rebuild the docs and literally point all the addresses and put all the ABIs here, and then this is our reference for later. So this is just automatically generated every time we do one of those releases that I showed you before. Okay, and then let's push forward a few more months. So now we're getting closer. So now we're in February of this year, and let's look at Beetlejuice. Funny fact, I thought it was Beetlejuice, and then I thought it was Beltagese, and then I had to look it up again. So it is Beetlejuice. That's the name of the star. So here we go. For those of you who've read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I also, back in the day, I always saw that as Beltagese. I'd actually never really thought it as Beetlejuice. It's quite an aside. And also, comedy doesn't really work when you don't have anyone around to bounce off, but here we are. So in Beetlejuice, we basically brought in this idea of what about our deployments? So those JSON files I showed you before, what if they're wrong? What if someone has changed the JSON file and it actually doesn't match what's on chain? So we had to bring in this idea of let's test that out. So yet again, another whole suite of tests designed for, are our JSON files actually, are they showing the source of truth, right? And at the same time, we actually got rid of our legacy folder and moved all of our tests into JavaScript. So we finally finished up all the final remaining tests that were left over in Python. Then we have our first Covert Deploy. And this was probably the most, one of the biggest ones from my perspective. This was the Hadar release. So this was the massive one that some of you may have seen. So interesting story here is that we started working with the OVM team around this time. So around COVID time, we were working with the Optimism team, I guess, was the name then. And they were working on getting us onto L2, right, with our L2 demo that some of you might have used. And the way that they do it, and the reason why we've actually chosen the optimistic approach, is they basically have their own transpiler that takes our contracts and compiles it for the OVM. So there's actually no changes needed for us, and that's huge, as you can imagine, with this much code and this much complexity. Something that we want to keep. We can't go to a sort of a generalized system or state channels. We need something that basically is as sophisticated as our contracts are. So the OVM team actually had one requirement, though. We need Solidity 5. And this had been something we'd been wanting to do for a long time, but, as you can imagine, just trying to actually, organize something like this and trying to get it across when users don't really care is a hard thing. But we managed to do it. But the problem was Truffle was not very good at handling split compilers. See, one of the requirements I had for doing this was that I wanted to be able to test these new contracts, the new, brains contracts, if you will, the new sort of underlying contracts with the existing proxies and the existing state contracts that I mentioned before that we can't change. They're already been compiled with Solidity 4 and they're already pushed up. So I wanted to test this interaction. And so I tinkered with Truffle, and I just started pulling my hair out. And I started looking at the code base, and Truffle was just not a viable solution at all. I'm sorry, but it just wasn't. So I'd been talking to the Nomic Labs team and met Franco at a number of conferences before, and I sort of gave it a go, and I was, gave Biddle a go, and I was just blown away. I actually posted on this a lot, and I'm doubling this up, but just have a look at this speed. So you've got Truffle on the right-hand side, and you have Biddler on the left-hand side, and after about half an hour of just configuring it, I was just shocked at how quick Biddler could do tests. And remember I said before about TDD, the idea of how quickly can we actually get test results? Biddler was an easy go.
Hey, Justin, I think we have to. Unfortunately, I think we have to move on to the next panel. But I think your AMA is set to start right now, actually.
Yeah. So anyway, thanks very much for everyone for checking it out, and I hope you'll enjoy my little dive into the history of Synthetix and tooling and testing we've done.
We've already got a lot of people jumping in over here. So everybody that's over here, if you could just start dropping your questions in the chat there, and Justin's going to hang out with us for a while here to get to them.
Yeah, let's do it. All right, so Victor, I'm not going to attempt your last name, but apologies. So we actually have our own proxy contract. We don't use it unstructured. So we have literally decided to go for separate proxies and state. So we don't even have our state inside there. I actually don't mind the unstructured approach, but these proxies were written, well before my time, and they were kind of decided on, and it really is so much of a hassle to actually go ahead and do it a different way. So this day, I probably would start with an unstructured. Diamond, look, the most I've seen it feels like a problem that people are trying to create a pattern for at a framework level that needs to be solved at a solidity level. That's kind of the way I feel that we're going with the Diamond standard. It feels like this whole another layer of a framework that that maybe is the future, but to me, I feel like there's an amount of work that are required to go into it. You really are locked into their way of doing something. But look, maybe it'll get better over time, and maybe people will coalesce around it. But yeah, I mean, CDs, look, achieving Brian's question about continuous deployment. I mean, it's super hard. We don't have anything quite like it yet. It's still a manual process. But I think what I didn't get into, what I'd like to, that I think is actually kind of nice, is how deterministic the blockchain is. So we're looking into forking now pretty heavily, the Ganache forking feature, which is coming to Biddler soon. And that allows us to basically, to fork any chain that we want and then do things on top. So it's actually somewhat easier in that regard. So we can pretty much, as long as we can get our contracts in, I think that actually connecting it's not such a big deal. Joshua's question about YFI. Honestly, I haven't been following as much as I probably could have. Kane's much deeper into that. It is interesting though, all these different staking contracts have taken our kind of code, especially with the YAMs and stuff. And they took a bunch of sort of our staking approach, but hey, it works and people are going for it. I do think Andre definitely has his head in the right place, and I think it'd be interesting to see where he comes out with next iteration and stuff. Is there upper limit to synths of synths, meaning what prevents it being SPX followed by an SSPX exposure? Well, I mean, so a synth is really, what a synth is really just a portion of our debt pool denominated in something, right? So, we can denominate it in the S&P if we wanted to, right? That's just some number, but then you say like an S in S&P would basically okay, well, you just take the price of what's on chain for the synth and then make another synth of that. There's no reason to do that, really. Also, to clear, if it's not obvious, head is that users don't control the synths. I mean, people can vote for synths and we can put them in through the protocol, but they're not something that someone can just create with UMA. It's kind of more in their system, is because any synth can be 100% converted to any other synth at any time with no slippage. Because of that, we have to predetermine and validate what sort of synths are allowed in the system, because if something doesn't have enough liquidity, someone can create I don't know, let's say one of the newer tokens out now, like a sushi or something. Someone could potentially manipulate the market, the real spot market. Our Oracle would take that price, and then they could basically make profit in the synthetic version by manipulating the spot market. Sorry, no, I didn't. For Christian, I didn't swap Truffle to Fiddle. No, so Fiddle is, as far as I know, Fiddle is just a way to share Ethereum code. No, we still use Truffle, but we basically pulled out Ganache and moved on to Biddler. So Biddler is kind of this framework that allows you to keep using Truffle, but they also provide a blockchain in the form of Biddler EVM. Part of the reason why that demo was so fast is because I use Biddler EVM. Honestly, I don't see a reason to go Truffle anymore. They're trying to go cross-chain and things like that, but to me, what Biddler are doing is great, and they're super responsive. They're just trying to roll things out. As I said before, so Biddler does both the Biddler sort of ecosystem, which includes something to run the tests, which can do truffle or waffle, but it can also do, it also has the node, so it sort of replaces Ganache. And they're actually looking at adding the fork feature from Ganache, which is probably the most important feature right now. Mark, what new dev tools like Bidler would be good to start with new Solidity dev? Definitely Bidler. I wouldn't even bother, honestly, with truffle. Sorry to say. Bidler, though, also doesn't do much for your actual deployment, so you will have to write them by hand. But I honestly think the way they've architected the code, being a Node.js engineer myself, is very extensible. It's very readable. I do think it's something that you could definitely get into and start playing with. I think the idea of having a Bidler node, like the Bidler EVM locally, and then creating your own little deploy and test scripts, like I was saying before, this idea of testing your deploy scripts separately, I think is a pretty powerful thing to do. So what else? But no, I personally write a lot. I try to write a lot of little things in NPM and stuff. I can share them in NPM. Little tools. Things don't always exist. I don't know. Look around, see what you get, see what you can find. It's quickly developing ecosystem, but compared to the React world, it's like we've got a long way to go. Joshua, what do I think about Curve DAO drop debacle? I mean, as you probably got from my point before about Wi-Fi, don't get too involved in the governance. And Kane has a lot of opinions on it. So yeah, it seems like a bit of a mess, but I'm not too close to it. So PT, what are the roadmap for Synthetix? The big thing is synthetic futures. So the idea of creating perpetual futures. One of the problems with the spot market that we have is that what we call Synthetix right now is the spot market is the ability to swap any SYNT for any SYNT. The problem with it is that it doesn't guarantee a balanced debt pool. So if you're an SNX staker, there's a possibility if everyone moves all their synths to synthetic ether or synthetic Bitcoin and the price of those moon, then the debt pool goes up, right? What you really want is balanced pool. And the way you get that with futures is this idea of you have open interest and you sort of balance the longs and the shorts, the people that are looking for upside movement, the people moving downside movement. So for us, a big part of it is futures. But when you're talking about adding Tesla shares, that's back on the spot market, and it is something we're looking at doing. We're just the very first thing we need to do as of Monday is move the rest of our feeds onto Chainlink. And then once we do that and we clean up some of our the last sort of owner functions, then we can start to get to the point of opening up to real world assets like Tesla shares and stuff. Phil, yeah, I actually software engineer. Yeah, so I've been a web full stack person for a long time. And my last place I was at was MongoDB. And I've actually been friends with Kane since high school. And, he's been into crypto since 2013 and very, deep into it. And he's been trying to convince me for a long time to get into crypto. And I was like, yeah, but it was really I started looking a bit more closely in 2016, 2017, but it wasn't until 2018 that I was really okay, I want to get into it. But I tell you, I'd like to think of myself as a pretty quick learner, but this stuff took a while. I wrote a couple of blog posts on it. Happy to share them with you if you want. But they're more of a high level, what does it mean to get into crypto, specifically Ethereum, but really how do you understand it? As you guys know now, for a number of you, that not only is there blockchain and then Ethereum, but now there's also this DeFi, and there's little layers that you can, excuse the pun, but I guess layers of complexity in each one, and how, where do you want to go? And we've obviously very specialized in Ethereum, but I kind of feel like it's the one with the best legs. My attitude towards anyone looking into, blockchain engineering, especially with smart contracts, is I don't see how you can beat the Ethereum developer community just yet. It's just so strong. Maybe they'll all move over at some point to something else, but I don't see it. And I'm pretty long what the Optimism team are doing in L2, and I think with Ethereum 2.0 getting into sharding, I think we'll see a lot of interesting developments. And I do actually think teams that have the ability to iterate like this and deploy very quickly are going to succeed, because I think what you're going to start seeing is we're going to see different versions of protocols on different shards. And then we're going to be how do you communicate your state between shards? And the only way to do that well is to be able to actually have good deployment processes and tests, so that you can actually have multiple versions of your protocol running, and communicating. And it's going to be an interesting future. SNX faults, yeah. Cool. Which development tools or specific matters do you think you should improve? RDE test it, like just over the environment, but not perfect experience yet. What do you mean? Do you think I should improve it, or like we should do it as a team, or it should be improved? I think, I mean, really, I mean, one thing I'd love to be able to do, and I don't see why this isn't hard, is to actually have, is actually have real TDD. I should be able to literally just write a test and just save the file, and it should just rerun very quickly. Give me like keep the EVM open, right, and just redeploy, like hot swap in a new contract, replace it, and try it again. Like I don't see why that's really not that hard. Any of us could probably write something to do that. But a lot of the testing tools right now are designed to like, okay, let's run my whole suite, deploy everything from scratch. I would like this idea of being able to very quickly deploy and test and get a really quick turnaround. I think that's the thing that I think I'd like to see the most of. Joshua, do we think more since like SDeFi? What is S Oracle? Oh, Oracle. I'm still not confused. What S Oracle would that be like? Oh, that would be like Link and Band and stuff like that. I get it, right? Yeah, I mean, we totally could. I mean, as long as the underlying assets in the index have enough liquidity out there, then yeah, we totally could do it. And it's something you could push. In fact, Joshua, you can basically write a SIP, in the SIPs, in the repo, you can propose a new SIP. It's pretty straightforward, but I would say the first thing is to get on Discord and see who's interested and stuff like that. Because right now we just have DeFi and the SEX token, but we're definitely happy to do more. Brian, is there anything that stands out as something you wish you learned earlier regarding work with Remix? Actually, look, honestly, I've only been doing Solidity for properly, I would say, for about a year and change, maybe a bit less. Sorry, a bit more maybe, but Remix has been my favorite because of that turnaround time. Like I tell to everyone, we have engineers who are trying to learn a bit more Solidity in our team. And I'm like, just Remix. Just seriously, the turnaround to like the trial and error, right? Like I'm the kind of learner, and I think a lot of you probably are. A lot of engineers are the tinkerer, right? I need to tinker with something. I need to like the console and in the browser, right, or the Node REPL. I need to get in there and play with things to figure it out. And so Remix has got to be the best way to do it. I don't think there's a particular plugin or anything with Remix. I just literally, like, we're coming up with ideas. I just create a few contracts, I deploy them, and I interact them, and I just look at the output of the logs and try to figure out, okay, what's actually happening, or debug, right? The one other thing that I would say is look into Tenderly, because Tenderly has like the best stack traces for like deployed contracts, hands down. Tenderly's block explorer, or at least for transactions, is amazing, and I really recommend it, especially with composed contracts. Things get really hard, and you like see you saw a revert reason. You're like, which contract is that even coming from, right? Like it's crazy to me that we don't. I mean, there was a period like when Etherscan didn't even have revert reasons, and you're like, as a team developing on Ethereum, you're like, well, how do I even tell the users what went wrong? Even now, like it's pretty crazy that like a user is expected to like see a revert string and what they got to search through your contracts. How are they even supposed to do that? How do they even know which contract maps to where in GitHub? And like, it's like, this is an area that like we really haven't pushed. I mean, even the ABIs, like having like trusting Etherscan is fine, but it's a pretty centralized way of like managing ABIs. Like there needs to be a repository for this. We need to work together with IPFS and connect the dots. Like it's still a cowboy world, if you ask me, and it's something I like to see more of. Any advice looking for Web 2 dev to get into blockchain? It's hard, man. Like as I said before, it took me months. People do hackathons. I mean, I guess maybe now, maybe not hackathons. There's a lot of stuff going on, but the really hard thing is context, right? Like conversations go on everywhere. Like someone says, "Yam, this trading." Like it's very, very hard if you're like a learner who's trying to build like a mental modeling for what this stuff is. It's very hard, and so the reason I try to write those articles on my Medium was like I wanted to sort of say, okay, if you go into each layer, what are you looking at? Okay, what is blockchain? Okay, got that. All right, so there's this Bitcoin, and then like there's this, this new version of it, like Bitcoin 2.0 that with Ethereum, and then some of them talking about Bitcoin 3.0, blockchain 3.0, and all that rubbish. But without having like like understanding a wallet, right? For example, you have to get what a wallet is. If you don't understand the core of what a wallet is, then I don't think anything else will make any sense. Because you'll see people using MetaMask in their browser, and you're like, "What are you doing? Like, what is happening here?" I think the first thing to get in to really focus on is what are wallets and how do they work. And not to the finest detail, but just as like really get what the purpose of them are. You know, how can I create multiple wallets from one seed phrase? Like, you need to sort of get that stuff, because otherwise everything else will be confusing. It's all hell. How do I see the future of DeFi and blockchains? I mean, the problem I see it right now is, I don't know how many of you are engineers, but even the ones who are, like, you look at Yam, you look at sushi, right? People look at sushi just came out. Who has the time to look into those contracts and figure out, you know, what's in there? I mean, you could take it and diff it to whatever. If they copied, I don't know if they did, but I presume they took the same stake and rewards contract that Wi-Fi and everyone else used, that was based on one of the ones that Anton from 1inch did for us from Unipool. You could look at the diff for that, and then as an engineer, and like figure it out. But like, I don't see how we're going to get to this. Like, it's going to get harder and harder, right? People, like smart people, someone's going to do an exit scam sooner rather than later, right? They're going to write something obscure. Everyone's just going to jump on it. They're going to see the yields. They're not going to think, and it's going to be bad for everyone. Yeah, I'm pretty shocked that that's the state of the world right now, and that nobody seems to think it's a problem. I'm going to grab a Tenderly link that I find really useful, just for. If you take this URL and the Tenderly, it took me a little while to get it, and then you can see a really nice stack trace. Tenderly true. Quick going. Yeah, no, we did. Sorry, Brent. Yeah, dude, we used to use Truffle Ganache, and I basically trashed it for Biddler. Yeah, Remix my favorite. Tenderly for stack traces. Biddler and Biddler EVM. Honestly, we only use Ganache because of forking right now, and forking is great, but it's coming to Biddler. Honestly, I honestly don't think. I don't feel like the Tenderly core project. The Truffle core project is going necessarily in the right direction for us. So I would say just go straight to Biddler and Biddler EVM. Is there anything that would change with your work if we see huge amount of value? I mean, it's hard, you know, it's scary. Like, one of the hardest things about engineering this space is that, and not just engineering, I guess, iterating on a product, is you have to reconsider things constantly. Like, if your token goes up 3x, right? Or, you know, even just that, the token goes up 3x, all of a sudden the assets on the value, like the value of, you know, your protocol as an attack vector goes up. You know, the bug bounty is now tripled, so to speak. It's hard, like, because you have to also reconsider things. Like, you might say, oh, when you're developing something, you might say, oh, well, this is an attack vector, but it's so expensive, no one will ever do it. Let's say you take an assumption about gas. You might have said, oh, well, gas is, you know, no one's going to ever pay more than 400, 500 for gas, right? That's not a true assumption. You know, Mariano from XMaker actually found that out. Like, he mentioned that one time, like having a max limit for Gwei in one of his pieces of code. We've had that too in the past. Like, there are constantly assumptions you make in the space that are proved wrong, and it's hard, and it's 24/7. It's 24/7, and that's the hard and scary thing about it. You know, but the cool thing is, because it's decentralized, you have a whole plethora of people around the world who are interested and passionate about getting involved and tracking things. And, you know, we've been very lucky to have a very strong community that are on top of all that. Matthew, yeah, it is confusing. It is, but a normie adoption, it is. I mean, what's hard about it is, first off, it's complex because it's, you know, a type of derivative. I mean, Maker is complex too in some way. Like, Maker is a similar idea. Like, you lock collateral and you issue debt, right? When you play with DAI, you probably don't think, oh, this is someone's debt over here. You may or may not think that, but it is, right? It's debt. When you play with a synth, but when you use a synth is someone's debt, right? But when you exchange a synth, you're basically re-denominating a bit of debt. The difference is the person doesn't hold that synth as their debt. Their debt is a pool, and your synth represents a part of that pool. And it's like a shared debt obligation that people have, and that's confusing. It is. But honestly, I think that, you know, it's a little bit like blockchain in general. It's so complicated. Like, understanding a wallet is not easy. as I said before, you understand, oh, I create this wallet, but it can be deterministically regenerated. My public and my private key were regenerated from this thing. And if I lose this thing, then anyone can, and someone gets it, then anyone can do anything and I'll never have retribution and there's no insurance. And like, that is confusing and hard for people. So there are layers of this. I feel like people push through when there's enough of an incentive, but the blockchain space in general does have there's definitely like a learning curve that may be turning off for some people, and it's something that I think about, but I don't know, because I don't want to encourage people to get into this stuff that they don't know what they're doing. So actually having these sort of these things to work through, these barriers to entry, I think are actually good, because people need to go through these barriers before they start spending a lot of their crypto. Honestly, ethers, Victor. Richard gets it. Look, Web3 has been getting better. I do like Chris Kowecki's been doing some great work over there. But I honestly prefer ethers. Our code base, our JS stuff is all ethers. Synthetix is still Web3. I'm happy to move over to it, but both of them have been working for me for now. But honestly, ethers has just been better. I feel like it's cleaner, more succinct, and very, very, very accurate. And good code. I've gone through a bunch of it, so I like using it. Type out those. Not some of those projects have been. Sorry, which project, Brent? Were you talking about? You mean Bidler? Alternative Strapper, yeah, Bidler. Bidler. Someone put it in before, I think. .io, right? Was it Bidler.io? I don't remember. Can someone post it in if they wouldn't mind? Thanks, Josh. Aussie. Oh, Kelly, it's super complex. Actually, I don't know on Hacker Noon. I've been shilling a little bit here, but I wrote a bunch at the beginning because I'm so frustrated with the space. It was like, what is going on? Guys, just give me a heartbeat. See if I can find it. Okay, there's 2 articles in this series that may be useful to you. No, Brent, yeah, Bidler is the one you want. So eFiddle is just like it's decent, but I don't know, it's been buggy to me. I don't know if anyone's seen it. eFiddle's good if you just want to link someone a working link of code, right? Like JS bin, right? Or paste bin or all that stuff. That's really what it's for. That was the whole purpose of eFiddle. But Bidler and Remix is probably the other one if you didn't catch that one, Brent. It was Remix. Ethereum, what is it? I don't know the link. Sorry, they got me using Chrome again, and all my stuff's in Brave now. So I'm a little slow. Yeah, Remix project. I needed it for the talk. Theodore, trading bots going on synth. So we had a yeah, I know, right? Brave's awesome. But yeah, I'm so brave now that going back to Chrome, it wasn't logged in, and when I came into the Smart Contract Summit, they're like, we need you as a speaker to jump into Chrome. Anyway, there's a trading bot stuff. We basically had L2, so we had this L2 competition, and it was amazing. But yeah, we had a bunch of people writing bots. I even wrote a script to actually do it. But yeah, there's also there are plenty of people who have bots that actually trade Synthetix right now. They trade synth to synth, so it's actually not too hard to do, and we try to write enough documentation to make it pretty straightforward. Would you welcome ASX if they wanted to create synths with you guys? I mean, you can't, like, no one can, I mean, anyone can suggest synths, but really what they need is that they need price feeds, and they need to be reliable price feeds, right? So they could work with Chainlink and be like, hey, with Chainlink, can we get a decentralized network put together for different things from the ASX? The thing is, though, that for right now with our architecture, the more synths we add, the more gas it costs. It's something we want to improve. But if there's demand for it, like for something like, if there was something to track the ASX, or I don't know what the index is for ASX, there's demand for it, and there was, feeds, we definitely could add them. You could propose it and we can get pushed in. Killer app for use case for synths. I mean, I think really like people use it for speculation. I mean, since like the spot market, this idea like, it's really, the real value is you want to speculate or you want to hold an asset without having to be exposed to anything. You don't want to have to go into Bitcoin. You want to be able to have something that takes the value of Bitcoin. I think the best thing of it is you can easily do baskets of things, right? Baskets of currencies, pieces, assets, like we do with the like the SD file, yes, sex. L2 demo experience. I don't know. I mean, for us, we've worked with quite a few different partners, like Chainlink and the Optimism team. For us, it's been helpful working with partners who get it, who kind of have the same engineering culture as you guys. That's what we found. The Optimism team definitely think of things and iterate things the way we do. We really, really like working with them for that reason. But I think personally, like, you need to think about what is your domain as such. Like for us, we have super complex contracts. We can't go into ZK rollups and have a generalized solution and like write it. I mean, we could, but then we're writing all this other code to maintain this other layer that is in the middle, and it's just not viable for us. So I guess it's like figuring out like what's the crux of your project? What actually is what do you need? What could you get onto L2? And then I guess then you got to weigh up. What are you trying to do? Look, solve for speed, or people on market, what have you. And on that second point, the best thing to something to always remember is lots of people will promise you things, but lots of people also aren't on mainnet. We've talked to teams over the years that said they'll be on mainnet in a few months, and a year later they still weren't on. So I'd also say that the people who are actually doing stuff are the ones you want to go with. And generally I would not go for anyone who's trying to roll their own thing, their own languages, their own anything. Like there's often not good reasons to reinvent languages or do these new things. Like when you have standards, like making people learn a whole new syntax or ecosystem is like, it's a little bit, I don't know, almost a little bit obnoxious, I think, unless there's a really good reason. Does Chainlink slow down the rate of development in the sense? Yeah, well, look, I mean, it's obviously slower than if we have an Oracle and we can put it together ourselves, but Chainlink team have a lot of resources, and they, the network's very wide, and they've been very, very quick at doing things. So it is slower and it's more decentralized, but it's, it is safer. So I wouldn't say the rate of slowdown is massive though, because for us, it's not like we're constantly adding new synths, but instead of maybe adding a new synth in a day or two, it might take more like, a week or so. But it's not something we do very regularly, for adding new synths. And we may do new inverse synths, but that doesn't require a new feed. And it's an inverse synth basically takes off from the same the feed that exists. So inverse, Ether, it just takes the price of Ether and does a little calculation to it. Do gas fees worry us? Yeah, I mean, it's not good. It's for sure. That's what L2 seems like a winner. I mean, what do you do? I mean, like the networks become popular. Tether's on ETH, it's an ERC20. I mean, what are you supposed to do about that? Like, it's not going to go away, and we eventually will have these problems again on L2 if things go right. Like, we're going to have people using everything, but then it's going to be about figuring out which shards to move on to and balancing. But I kind of just think it's the nature of the beast right now, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely disappointing to us that particularly smaller holders can't do things, because for some of our transactions cost $50 effectively in ETH, and that's ridiculous. That's not reasonable, and it's something we obviously don't want. So hence why L2 is coming very soon. Testing frameworks in JS. Oh, wow, that's Christian. I don't know how to answer that one. That's a big one. Yeah, there's a lot. I might have to pass. I don't know if anyone else wants to offer some suggestions to help testing tool frameworks in JS. But in JS in general, I think like choosing a book, like I always used to reference Effective JavaScript to people, because Effective JavaScript as a book is just very good at listing all the nuances of JS. And if you're going to get into JS, you need to understand the nuances, because if you don't get how promises work and you don't get how like the core stack and the how timeouts are working, stuff like that, it can be hard to get under the hood. So Effective JavaScript is my best recommendation on that. Arbitrum, not massively, but honestly, we haven't been that focused on what they can do. Potentially, it could be really useful for calculating some of our debt and helping us get to off-chain calculations to reduce gas. Yeah, Malik. Yeah, I was actually thinking about Solidity when I said that. I was literally being like, yeah, Solidity. But I can see why, like you're running a Turing complete language in a small thing, in a small little container and EVM, I can get it. But I was very excited, and still am, I guess, for wasn't. Like, I do love the ability to be able to use Rust, right, rather than Solidity. I don't know if anyone knows where that's at now, but that's exciting. Do you push Chainlink to add newer price feeds? Yeah, we will ask them pretty regularly, and I think a lot of the other projects like Aave and stuff will also ask them as well. Could Synthetix be agnostic to Ethereum? We could. I mean, but would we? I don't know. Right now, I don't see a reason to. I'm not like, yeah, I just don't see a massive reason to do that. We did actually try. Like, one of the first things I was doing when I came full time on the project was I was working on porting us to EOS. So I was writing C++ contracts, and I really don't know much C++. That was fun. But the EOS community, like the dev community, was atrocious. Like, it was one Telegram channel. I constantly kept reaching out to one of the Block One or whoever they were. Be like, hey, I wrote this open source project. I did this. Like, can you share it in the community? It's like crickets. It's ridiculous. And I think the thing that I get that the EF is slow at doing things, deliberating, but I really admire them for this idea of writing specs and having you have the Geth team, you have the parity team, and now you have Lighthouse and Prismatic, and I love that approach. I think it's amazing. That's really taking decentralization to the max, and not only literally decentralizing to the point where you're saying, I'm just going to write a spec, right, and allow different teams to go in. And I don't know, I think they just got the right stuff, and I do think Vitalik's in his benevolent dictator, he has this this kind of beacon ability to sort of be benevolent or be seen as benevolent, also being incredibly bright and surrounding himself by people who just get shit done. And I think it's something that we value a lot and we align to. Are there any dApps that are talking to you about using OVM as well? Not specifically that I know of, but I think a lot of people are looking at it. I think everyone's at this point where they're like, what do we do? What do we do? I'm, which L2 solution, what have you, you have to do something. I don't know. You ask me, if you can compile contracts and get them, as is, and you get them on the OVM, it seems like a winner. OVM also has a lot of connectivity into the EF, and it seems to me like it's a no-brainer. This is where ETH 2.0 is going with shards anyway. So why wouldn't you want to, future-proof and get on there? Reinvented language. JVM. Oh God, JVM. Yeah. Mocha Chai. Yeah, Victor was applying to someone, Christian, I think, about JavaScript. Honestly, I am if you want my take on things, Jest, Yarn, even React. I love what React has done with the virtual DOM and where they've gone, but honestly, I don't like supporting Facebook. I don't, yes, I still have a Facebook account, but I don't like their approach. In fact, I feel like they've become what Microsoft used to be, and I just don't like to support that. Now, it's funny you say that because I actually go NPM over Yarn, and now NPM is bought by Git, which is owned by Microsoft. So it's kind of really funny that we're back here. But I do feel like Nadella's got the right approach. He just, we'll see what happens with GitHub. But I'm very hesitant to go towards things that are run by companies. So so with JavaScript testing, I usually use Mocha, Chai, and Sign-On for stubbing and stuff. So definitely get into Sign-On if you're running tests. You should be mocking and stubbing as much as possible. What about think about Near? Actually, I don't know that much Rust. I just think it's one of the languages. I don't know enough bits and pieces, but I think it's one of the I do think it's one of the languages that's coming out these days that has legs. I mean, Go as well has legs with the different use cases, but I do think Rust is, where C++ will eventually, hopefully, evolve into. I don't know much about Near protocol. Haven't been that interested to get too deep. As you can imagine, there's just so much shit goes on all the time in Ethereum. So how much am I going to look around? I do poke my head up around, but it's been kind of relieving in the last year to just keep my head in Ethereum and focus on that rather than trying to be okay, what is everyone else doing? I think after the whole EOS debacle, I was just this sucks. And honestly, one thing I do like about Ethereum, is that even though there's a lot of good engineers here, there's still so much fertile ground for like working on open source stuff. Like there's just so many things haven't been done that could be done. Like I throw together stuff, people just throw together stuff all the time, but like it's very easy to be the first to do stuff. So I'm all gung ho for it. Yeah, React to the Vue. I don't know. React, like Facebook is just smart. Like they just literally threw money at some of the best people, like Sebastian McKenzie, right? The guy did 5 to 6. What was it? 6 to 5? I don't remember. Yeah, 6 to 5 or something. I don't know. The old Babel, right? And they just throw money at them. Hey, work on open source, blah blah. I mean, Google do it as well. It's nothing new, but they just bought everyone. And I think they got burned by what happened with PHP, and everyone went off PHP, and Facebook invested it. But I don't know, man. I just feel like it's wrong. I'm not saying don't use React, but you got to understand, like React has become this whole thing. Like I guess I was also burnt by the whole Grunt world. If any of you are familiar with that, there was like this build system on Node called Grunt, and then everyone was doing Grunt plugins, and then you were constantly waiting for the Grunt plugin to update because you needed the version of thing that Grunt plugin was now deploying for, depending on. And it just creates this layer of crap. Like I definitely say less layers of crap are good. The sad thing is like, when you buy into something like React, then everyone's like, okay, you need React this, React that, and everything's glued together, and it's good for that like sub ecosystem. But I feel like it creates this, developers and people that just really only understand React and they don't understand JavaScript. But I can go on about this for too long, so I'm gonna stop. Any affinity for Synthetix to operate on regulated markets? Not sure what you mean. You mean to have synthetic Tesla and stuff? I don't know if framework's the right way, but truffle is truffle, drizzle. Guys, creating when do people understand you're creating these new barriers to entry? It's a little bit of a dev sorry, I get on my high horse a little bit. Like everyone's had fun. Like, I'm going to create this library and stuff like that. But I mean, DHH, the Rails guy, has a lot of opinions on this. The DHH, David Hanson, whatever his name is a pretty out there guy. But he's a big on, don't write a library until you have 3 or more different use cases. And I feel like the same way of frameworks, but it's so much fun to write one and be like, oh, I can solve this problem and solve this problem and solve this problem. But you're forcing people to learn this whole new way of doing things. You attaching them to your way of doing things, and then there's a chance you don't last, right? Like look at Backbone, right? We were using Backbone back in the day, and it disappeared. I mean, Backbone still exists, but why would you? You really should be thinking should I be doing this? A little bit like we're talking before about languages, but I really think you should be thinking about, should you be creating a framework for someone? Should you be making it a lot of frameworks too, a lot of the docs, the guides are always like, okay, here's how to get started. I'm like, yeah, okay, great, I can get started, but then how do I go deep? I feel like they're all focused on getting early people hooked into it rather than being like what are we, really solving for? I mean, how do we do it? And I unfortunately, I was so jaded that I dismissed Biddler a little bit earlier than I should have, because it was a little bit like that. Franco, one of the team members, was approaching me in conferences like, oh, we're some, you guys have a custom deploy script, you should use Biddler, it's so much better, we do this, we do that. And I was like, no, I don't like the idea of going off the reservation, doing something, because it was still very much sort of a pet project at the time. He's like, oh, we got EF support. And I was like, oh, no. And I'm like, oh, I don't like this. And he's like, dude, we got modular, we got plugins. And I was like, it sounds good. And then, curmudgeon old me, I finally played with it and looked at it, and I was like, oh crap, it's actually, good, and the code's good. And if you want to look at the Synthetix code base, look at how easily we basically customize things. Let me just quickly link to it using Biddler. We have a little config file. In fact, if I'm showing I can just share my screen, can't I? I'm probably over time, but I don't think anyone really cares right now, so we'll just keep going. Well, it does feel like I'm talking to myself. Okay, so here's Biddler. Here's a config file for Biddler. There's got a bunch of different plugins, right? And we can use coverage and stuff like that. And you can just do all cool shit. You can say, okay, I want to create a logger. I link with legacy support. I overload contracts. I do setups for legacy. Like, it's very easy. Like, it's one little script, a couple of 100 lines, and I basically configured all different things. I'm able to add the optimizer on if I want to. I'm able to add on gas run. I can do grepping. I can do everything. Like, it's great. It's really, really customizable. And I was, I had to take my hat off to them and say, look, you guys, you did create something where there was an incumbent, but what you've created is so much better, and it makes me think, I can't believe I ever used the incumbent. All right. Last question. I'll do Christian Demansky. What are your thoughts on wallet privacy and transaction privacy? I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by wallet privacy and transaction privacy. Maybe if you just elaborate a little bit more about what you're trying to get to there. I mean, one thing I will say about transactions, though. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, honestly, yeah, look, I haven't, probably the best thing we have right now for privacy, I think, on Ethereum, or the most common, easily used thing is Tornado, right? For those who haven't used it, it's a mixer. You can use Tornado, and lots of people do use Tornado for that. But as for a different chain and going on to Monero, I mean, you totally could if you need to. I kind of feel like there's just a lot of friction going around, and I'd rather personally just don't see the need to go to another chain right now, unless you're massively trying to hide something, obfuscate something. But I do think the one thing that's very challenging for people coming into the space and not getting is how the chain of events connecting your wallets together. So a lot of people just don't realize that. They really just don't get it, and they just sort of think they do different things and don't realize everything is visible. And there are a lot of very smart people that can go back and see what you've done, and how I think once one thing's attached to your name, and once you've been doxxed, so to speak. So I do think it's one of those things that I think as you get more mature in the space, you start realizing, you realize the implications of every action that you do, and dots connected, which it demasks your pseudonymous address, addresses and stuff. So you just have to be kind of careful. It's something you get better at learning, I think, over time. People get it. But I remember when I first got into space, I was I just didn't get so many things like doxing and stuff like that, and it became a joke later on. When anyone ever posted their public address, or they would say something in a channel oh, my transaction just failed. You could easily go to Ethereum, you go to Etherscan, find out the failed transaction, and you can dox the person, right? And then that all of a sudden someone can associate a Discord username with it. So it's just it's just stuff you got to look out for and understand. Would I want to see it for Ethereum? Hasn't been something I've been I'm massively pushed for. It would be good, I guess, but I'm not oh, this is something we definitely need. I don't know. I've enjoyed, one thing that's really interesting and difficult to do though is the amount of data mining and historical research you can actually do with transactions, especially when it's especially when there's been an attack or something. It's actually really interesting to go back and look through history of transactions and sort of see where things were done. And so when we mask that up with privacy, the more we'd hide that. And I think that would be a real shame, especially as a protocol developer. It really helps being able to sort of go back and look through these sort of, almost like you're going through fossils to try and figure out what was the chain of events that led to something happening. I don't know if you guys saw the Dan Robinson post on, was it a Paradigm? He did that mempool thing, Dark Forests. So interesting. Definitely read this stuff. You guys haven't seen this. So good. Check this out. Really good to read. Really interesting read, and scary, what goes on and how the mempool, if you don't understand what the mempool is and how that works, you definitely should know that any transaction that has not been mined, that is waiting to be mined, is visible to anyone who has the right setup to do it. So yeah, the mempool stuff is going to become more and more of a problem, and it's definitely as Ethereum gets bigger and bigger, it's going to become, there's lots of people figuring out ways to make money on that. So be aware of it. Cool. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. So I just powered through all this stuff, just ran, but I hope it was useful. Lots of fun. Having a chat, getting some ideas across. Thanks for listening to me rant a little bit. I like ranting. Yeah, and if you want to, you obviously can find me on Twitter if you need to, at Justin J Moses, and that's my handle on all social media. So you can reach out to me and stuff if you need to. Cool, but honestly, if you want to learn more about our code and stuff, generally don't do DMs, not just because just obviously just trying to manage lots of stuff. The best way to find me, I think, if you want to talk, especially if you want to talk about the Synthetix protocol, any technical thing, is Dev Portal in our Discord. I really think that's the best place. We have lots of really good users in there who are just really, really stunning. They really get it. Especially, and if you want to just wax lyrical on, writing, working with Ethereum and stuff, we can happy to chat about it. I'll just send an invite to that in our Discord. Take me half a second. This is the best place to ask. Yeah, I didn't even get into the graph, so that's a whole other thing. But anyway, you can, if you're interested in the graph, you can learn more. But we rely on the graph a lot. I'm sorry, I didn't even mention it. I didn't even think of it before. But we rely on the graph a lot for basically, we rely on the graph a lot for all our stats, basically because, it's very difficult to crawl events in Ethereum. So the graph basically does it for us. And we use the graph and their APIs to basically, tell everyone like what are our stats and stuff. So highly recommend it. Cool. All right. Thanks everyone. Appreciate your time. Have an awesome rest of your weekend.